Thank you so much, Karen, Copenhaver. I'll leave you to that.
I am a lawyer. I'm sorry. There are so many things that you just said that are prescient to what I want to say, but I'm going back. So if he's 301, I'm 101. I am a lawyer. I have been working in the technology industry since 1979 when I was with IBM. I've been doing open source since about 1996, and I've been working with the Linux Foundation since 2006. And it has been a wonderful ride. And what I was asked to come today and tell you a little bit about is what we've learned along the way, and to do that very quickly. But the first thing, we'll see, we may have a little clicker problem. But the first thing I want to start with is just this word, enlightened self-interest. And, you know, I'm a girl. Have to say I'm a girl. When I talk about the fact that I'm in open source, many people like to conclude that that's because I like things that are very kumbaya moments. You know, open source is about being nice, it's about being generous, it's a wonderful thing to do, and sometimes that is the reason that you do it. But for people who haven't been through the process that most of you have been in, they have to realize that this is about enlightened self-interest. There we go. So I wanted to make that first piece. We're talking here about enlightened self-interest. Why companies do this is because it is in their best interest. So the LF is, the Linux Foundation, is this corporate collaboration, but it's a very rich tech ecosystem. And I just wanted to, all these numbers are pretty amazing. We have 800 members. We have 80% of the Fortune 100 tech and telecom, and we have 100 open source projects. So here's the growth in Linux Foundation open source projects. You know, we started out and we're down at 0 because we didn't grow because we had Linux. But what we were doing when we were building Linux in all those early years is allowing the developers to figure out how this should work. And when Linux became so successful, and it is amazingly successful, people said, I want to build this the way you built that. I want to learn from all the things that went right and all the things that those developers figured out to figure out how to build this next generation of technology. And look at that takeoff. 100 projects that have come. Now, I want to go way back in time because somebody in the beginning actually made this leap. And there probably were people across the industry, but one of the big leaps that occurred was in the IBM Executive Suite. And if you haven't heard this story, it's sort of an interesting one. So at this point in time, I want to tell you a little bit of a context for something else that was going on. There was a wonderful, wonderful professor at Harvard Business School named C.K. Prahalad. And he was teaching, and it was the person that was published and spoke the most often from that school at the time. And he was teaching this idea of, do you know why your customers buy your products? Do you know what they actually pay you for? What are your differentiators? Because there's a large part of your product that your customers don't actually care about. And then there's a differentiator that makes them decide to buy from you. Do you know what that is? And are you putting your resources and your talents behind that thing that your customer cares about, right? It seems pretty obvious. The example that was sort of a joke at the time was the car. There were these two cars, very similar, coming from Germany. They came to the United States. One was very successful, one not so much so. The other one was very successful in Europe. You know what the difference was? There was a cup holder. Germans don't eat in their cars. United States, they didn't want to buy a car that didn't have a cup holder. You know, what was the differentiator? It's the cup holder. What they were talking about at the time was, what is your core infrastructure? You know, what is your core infrastructure? So a fellow named Irving Waldansky-Berger walked into the room and had one slide. At that time we called them foils, overhead. He put it up and he talked about it for 4 hours in front of the executives. And he showed them a sweep of operating systems. There were 37 that IBM supported at the time. Operating systems are very hard to build, particularly then. The resources that knew how to build an operating system were very rare. IBM had many of their developers focused on building these operating systems, and there were 37 different operating systems. What he wanted to say is if you built one and you built it with everybody else, here's the thing that you could focus your resources on. Because do you know what? Your customers don't care about the operating system. And they don't particularly want to pay you for it. The customers care about the solutions that come on top. But you have your best and your brightest devoted to building those operating systems. What could you do if you had an external development force that was helping you build and maintain and extend that operating system? And what could you do if you had one? If you had one, and here's what's amazing, is he had on the chart, he had something called pervasive computing. This was 1999. Nobody knew about cell phones at that time. He said pervasive computing all the way up to supercomputers. What could you do if you had one? And at that time, that was sort of a ridiculous statement. If I could bring you my charts about Linux, you would know that 97% of the supercomputers are now Linux, and a large percentage of your cell phones are running Linux as well, and everything in between. So that focus on what is the core infrastructure and what are your differentiators was a big piece of devoting resources to Linux. Now, there also is a story about the Apache web server, where IBM at the same time was developing a web server. Brian Behlendorf, who's really one of the unsung heroes of the computer industry, was building this little thing called Apache. And IBM had spent an enormous amount researching their web server. And at one point they looked up and said, can we go look at what the kids are building? And they found out it was better. It wasn't a little better, it was a lot better. And that became Apache. So these same dynamics operate across different industries. But executives who have never been through the process of understanding this are, when you come in, often do think you're looking for the kumbaya moment. And what you have to do, exactly as we've just heard, is to turn it into a discussion of enlightened self-interest. The other thing that I want to talk about is that the security and the safety comes from this shared vulnerability. This is very important, is when you have a lot of companies all dependent upon the same base, all of those companies have some sense of assurance that if anything goes wrong, that all of those companies are at risk. All of those companies' resources are going to be available to make sure that whatever it is gets fixed. It isn't a question of the license. The license can be important, mildly interesting. The community around the code and the resources that are backing it up is what makes it important, is what makes it commercially reasonable, is what makes it long-term viable. So it's that shared dependability. The other thing I want to tell you about is a story I got from a developer, which helps me understand open source a lot. We originally thought of these developers as, these guys eating pizza in the basement, which I've always said is so silly because the most organized people on earth are developers. I mean, they're not chaotic. But we were thinking about these people, they went to work all day and then they went home at night, right? And they would code. And people would say, why would you do that? Why did it make any sense for you to code at night? And one developer said to me, no, you don't understand. What didn't make any sense is what I was doing during the day. Because you see, during the day, I had somebody come in from marketing and tell me, here's what we're going to develop and we're going to release it on Tuesday. And I'd say, well, that's a stupid idea. First of all, it doesn't work like that. And second of all, if we release it on Tuesday, it's going to be garbage. So no, we got a trade show. We got to release it on Tuesday. So we spend our time writing and releasing this code that's full of bugs. He said, how else do you think we convinced an entire industry that releasing code full of bugs was normal and necessary? Now, at night, I got to go home and pick a problem that I thought was really challenging and work on it hard until I was really proud of it. And then submit it to a community that would accept it and value it and appreciate the work that went into it. Now, what doesn't make sense about that? You see, the most important thing that we need to learn about open source communities, from my point of view, is that they took the developers, these rare and wonderful individuals in all fields, not just software, who actually understand how these technologies work. And we put them back in the driver's seat. We're all incredibly, not only indebted, but vulnerable to those very few people around the globe who understand how the technologies that we're all dependent upon actually work. And one of the things that you're all involved in is creating an architecture of participation where the places where those people reside, which are corporations, are learning how to come together to defend us and them, their technologies and us as citizens, as global citizens. It is not a small thing. It is an important thing. When you think about that, where are these technical resources to respond to critical situations? They're in your companies. They're in other companies. Companies need to know how to make them available when they're needed to defend these platforms that we're all dependent upon. Thank you very much.